This video was made possible by Olafly. Unlimited data in China and all of Asia. No roaming charges. More in a moment. If you are loyal Visualeconomik subscribers, you already know how much we love to talk about China. We have talked about how the Asian giant has become richer, about how its cities have grown, about its strong technological development, and of course, we've also talked at length about the Chinese real estate bubble and the other threats that the country is currently facing. However, this time we're going to talk about something completely different. Today, when we talk about China's growth, we are still talking about a country whose income is at the global average, still well below Western standards. Even so, don't think for a moment that this has always been the case. For most of its history, the Chinese Empire was one of the most prosperous regions on the planet. The Europeans looked with envy at their delicate silk fabrics, the higher level of their mathematicians, and the vast trade routes they had mapped out by sea and land. The Chinese of the 12th century had already mastered agricultural techniques that would not be seen in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. It was the country with the highest agricultural productivity on the planet. But Visualeconomik community, we are not only talking about agriculture. By the 11th century, the Celestial Dragon Empire was producing 5 to 6 times more iron per capita than the most prosperous regions of Europe. The compass, gunpowder, paper, and even the printing press were all inventions of ancient China.
China has been long one of the richest countries, one of the most fertile, best cultivated, most industrious, and most populous countries in the world.
Now, let me ask you a question. Who was the Chinese Galileo or Newton? The truth is that no name comes to mind, although perhaps it is due to simple ignorance of such a distant reality. Nevertheless, the truth is that apart from gunpowder and paper, there are no major, relatively modern scientific developments such as the steam engine, the light bulb, or the microscope that took place in China. Despite the relatively advanced economy of the Asian giant, it was, in contrast, the Europeans who carried out both the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution. So the question is very clear. What happened for China to fall so far behind? Why did it end up losing the technology race if it was so far ahead? And pay attention, because this is not a simple matter at all. In fact, it has been so much talked about that it even has a name of its own. This phenomenon is known as the Needham question, after the great scientific historian Joseph Needham, who wrote more than 25 volumes on the advancement of Chinese science, medicine, and technology. And before we continue, let us also mention one thing. It is clear that China remains an ever-expanding powerhouse, moving at an impressive pace to consolidate its position as a world leader. It is highly likely that industry will increasingly become an attraction for thousands of travelers globally, leading it to become a hotspot for business travel. And before we continue, let us also mention one thing. It is clear that China remains an ever-expanding powerhouse, moving at an impressive pace to consolidate its position as a world leader. It is highly likely that industry will increasingly become an attraction for thousands of travelers globally, leading it to become a hotspot for business travel. It is well known that business cannot thrive if your cell phone is not working properly, as the phone is where meetings are held, along with daily applications, investment tracking, among other things. Therefore, it is essential to have a solution that allows you to keep using it while traveling, thus avoiding costly roaming charges or complications with changing plastic SIM cards in places where you don't understand the language and you may be in an emergency situation late at night without support with an unusable card, leaving you completely unprotected. Today, thanks to technological advances, you can connect anywhere in the world easily. With Olafly's International Digital SIM Card, or eSIM, you can connect from wherever you want, whenever you need it, simply by verifying the duration you require. This solution provides you with unlimited data in less than 1 minute in China, Japan, USA, and more than 180 destinations. You will be able to maintain your productivity during the trip through a digital installation via the QR code. And if you need help, you will have 24/7 support available. Before you arrive in China, activate your plan and you'll be ready to stay connected with unlimited data without worrying about losing your connection. Use your apps, hold meetings, access your social media, use Maps, Uber, and other apps without worrying about running out of data, and make the most of your travel experience, whether it's for business or tourism. Find out more about Olafly's innovative eSIM technology by visiting the link in the description, and don't ever be disconnected from the world around you. As we've already mentioned in the introduction, the Needham question is a really complicated question to answer, and economists do not quite agree. But we have to start somewhere, and the truth is that there is one point on which everyone agrees. In the 15th century, under the orders of a Ming Dynasty emperor, a Chinese naval fleet composed of 62 large ships undertook 7 large-scale expeditions, exploring from the seas south of China up to the Persian Gulf. China was a maritime and military power. Now, how many of these expeditions do you think were carried out in the following century? The same number? Half perhaps? Well, no, 0. There were 0 expeditions. But we are not only talking about expeditions. For some almost incomprehensible reason, the next Chinese emperor imposed a total ban on inter-country travel by ship. To give you an idea of how strict the ban was, more than 3,500 ships were ordered to be burned. Since then, and for the 400 years that the naval self-blockade lasted, China was practically isolated from major international affairs. And as you can imagine, this meant that the Chinese lost access to the latest innovations, from the spectacular development of the banking system to the wonders coming from the new continent. As a result, while the rest of the world grew wealthier, China stagnated and even began to lose purchasing power. However, don't think that this solves the whole puzzle. No, far from it. Not only do you have to wonder why on earth China decided to destroy its maritime power in such a way, but we must also ask why China could not have evolved technologically on its own, even though it was isolated from the world. So with this in mind, we can point to 3 major problems that weighed down the Asian giant's technological development. Let's go through them. If there is one thing about China that is as true today as it was 500 years ago, it is that there are a lot, and I mean loads, of Chinese. And for some economists, this is the reason why they never carried out an industrial revolution. As you can see in this table, the land available to support food production in China became increasingly scarce compared to an ever-increasing population. And what were the consequences of all this? The most significant is that in China, there was never a shortage of cheap labor. As there was a surplus of people, wages remained very low, and employers had less incentive to invest in automation. This explains that while the Europeans were used to the Gutenberg printing press, the Chinese used a much more primitive woodblock printing press, which needed 3 times longer and twice as many workers. What's more, and as if that were not enough, despite having invented paper money centuries ago, Chinese banking was very underdeveloped. To give you an idea, while a Dutch entrepreneur financed his investments at 2 or 3% per annum, a Chinese one did so at rates of up to 42%. Crazy. On top of that, many Chinese emperors were completely hostile to free trade, property rights, and free speech, which translated into little entrepreneurship, little innovation, and little entrepreneurial activity.
In China, there was no private initiative. There was a series of state monopolies covering the main consumer products such as salt, iron, tea, alcohol, and foreign trade.
Nevertheless, some economists have pointed out that this explanation is somewhat incomplete. Chinese wages did rise in some periods of population growth, and some dynasties, such as the Tang, were quite friendly to private initiative. But as we have said, there are still 2 more reasons for the great decline of the Chinese Empire with respect to Europe. Let's ask ourselves a question. What political system did China have? Well, many historians and economists define it as bureaucratic feudalism. The emperor had much greater power than the absolute monarchs of Europe, and instead of nobles spread throughout the territory, what he had was an army of highly hierarchical bureaucrats. China was a huge and completely unified territory. All this meant that in China, there was never much political competition. If the emperor gave an order that was very harmful to the economy, there were no nobles or independent territories that could oppose it, as was the case in Europe. For example, think for a moment what would have happened if the Spanish Empire had decreed the naval self-blockade imposed by China. In that case, it would have been the Portuguese, the Italians, or the English who would have gone to sea to discover America. Let's just say that Europe had the advantage of competing between countries, laws, and monarchs, and that was something that also applied to science. That is, if a scientist was censured and persecuted in one European country, he or she could always move to another and continue working, something that would be directly impossible in China.
The collection of more or less independent states in Europe created favorable conditions for scientific development. China, on the other hand, was ruled by a dominant ideological system backed by absolute political power, and no genuine public debate was allowed.
But in view of the economic and political motives, there is still one that generates much debate, but which nevertheless could be as relevant as the two previous ones. Take a look. Do you remember the maritime expeditions that China made in the 15th century? The commander of the first expeditions, Zhen He, was known and respected in Europe as the Chinese Marco Polo. However, there was a huge difference between Marco Polo and Zhen He. While the former was tremendously respected among Europeans who told his stories in taverns and fantasized about going to sea, the Chinese hardly knew their national hero. It just seemed that the wonders of other places that Zhen He described, they couldn't care less about. The Chinese were not interested in the outside world. Perhaps the most famous example of this is the letter Emperor Qin Long wrote to George III, refusing a trade agreement because, according to him, the English had nothing of interest to them. And let's see, this happened in the year 1973, by which time the English had at least 200 years of technological superiority over the Chinese, and the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. So you tell me. Be that as it may, and in view of all these theories, let me now ask you a question. What if, in reality, the economic, political, and cultural problems that have weighed China down have a common origin? One deciding factor that is the origin of everything, and which has so far gone unnoticed. Well, Visualeconomik community pay very, very close attention.
A test to rule them all.
Throughout this video, we've been telling you that China's divergence from the West began to occur from the end of the 15th century, when maritime expeditions were suddenly banned. However, for Needham, the historian we told you about earlier, this delay actually occurred 3 centuries later. And let's see, the truth is that there is not much data to determine the specific dates yet. In recent decades, there has been a huge project to collect and digitize files related to the world of innovation. And thanks to this progress, we can make graphs like this one. What you are seeing on the screen is a chart showing how innovative China has been over the centuries. As you can see, the two most innovative dynasties were really ancient. Here we are talking about the warrior states of 475 BC and the Han Sui Interregnum of 220 AD. The curious thing is that in 581, a new dynasty arrived, the Sui dynasty, which caused innovation to plummet and plunged the country into stagnation. From that point on, average innovation over the next few centuries plummeted from an average of 25.4 points to just 9.4 over the next 700 years, less than half. We are talking about the Sui dynasty, which conditioned the future of China forever. And the question is, why? Well, first of all, because this dynasty unified China again, which up until then had been divided into a multitude of microstates for 300 years. This led to the lack of competition between countries that we mentioned earlier. But secondly, in order to manage the vast Chinese territory, the Sui dynasty began to use officials, and above all, selected them with a public examination known as Keju. And how important was this test? Well, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Chinese university entrance exam, the Gaokao, an exam known for the extreme effort students put into it. Well, the Keju test was its predecessor. In the Ming dynasty, for example, between 2 and 3 million applicants took the exam on a regular basis, and of these, only 400 people managed to pass. That means that passing the first round of this exam was harder than getting accepted into Harvard. And why are we telling you all of this? The reason is that if you remember, China was a bureaucratic feudalism. The positions of importance did not fall on the nobles, but on the officials who passed this exam. That is, anyone who could aspire to ascend to the upper class. So what's the problem? The problem was that Keju only tested participants on memorizing Confucianist texts. No science or technology, just Confucianism. And so the brightest minds throughout China spent decades memorizing poems and philosophy rather than developing inventions or undertaking business ventures. As you can imagine, this in itself was a problem. On top of that, Keju had no limit to the number of times it could be taken, so many people took the test for several decades without any results. In this way, many people trying to get into the civil service became indoctrinated with the Confucianist culture, and as a result, China became culturally culturally homogenized in a massive way. This in turn gave more power to the government and the stagnant culture. Yasheng Huang, a renowned Chinese economist, summarizes the importance of this test in shaping the Chinese state.
Keju had a deep penetration both in society as a whole and throughout history. It was an incubator of values, norms, and ideas, and exerted an influence on the ideology underlying the Chinese mind. It was a state institution designed to enhance the power and capabilities of the state.
Having seen all this visual economic community, now the questions are for you. Which explanation convinced you the most about the stagnation of the Chinese Empire? Was the Imperial Examination and the bureaucratization of society the real cause of this backwardness? Or do you think that there are even more factors that could explain everything? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel, hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.